problem. You might be feeling this in your deltoids, and if you are, that is normal. Just with practice, they'll get stronger. Starting again in clockwise, and separate, back together, separate, back together, separate, back together, separate, back together. Now separated, turning clockwise with it, so you're turning to the right. Now come back together and separate and back together. Then we're going to turn left with it, and then we're going to separate and come back together and turn with it. So now we turn right with it, and now separate, back together, separate, back together, separate, and now turn left, so the anti-turn. Okay, yay, we sort of got one done there. Woo! Okay, let's do another one. And starting in clockwise again, 5, 6, 7, 8, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together. One more time, separate, holding there, turning to the right, and come back together, separate, together, separate, together, turn left, separate, together, separate, together, turning right, and separate, together, separate. Now turning left in the anti-turn. Woo! Let's try the combination in the opposite direction. Yikes! So counterclockwise corkscrew, this guy here, and still inside corkscrew. So now separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together. Now separate, turn left with it, so we're turning in turn. Now together, separate, together, turn anti-turn, so you're turning to the right, separate, together, separate, together, turn left, so we're turning in turn with it now. And now we're going to separate, together, separate, and I'm going to turn right with it. That's the anti-turn. And then come back together, and let's do it again. So separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together. Now separate one more time, turn left with it, come back to the front, bring it together, separate, together, turn to the right with it, anti-turn, separate, together, separate, together, turn left with it, in turn, separate, together, separate, together, separate. Now turn right with it, anti-turn, to complete the combination, and come back together. And you might need to rest the arm for a second. Let's do a little Pilates underhand giant, just to contrast the tiny little moves. And if you're feeling bold, turn with that into the overhand giant. And then bring it down, shake it out. Okay, we're going to do another 2 of them in counterclockwise, if I can actually get through it. Here we go. Starting in counterclockwise, corkscrew, and separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate. Turn right, so anti-turn. Come back to the front, come together, separate, come together, turn left, in turn with the corkscrew, separate, together, separate, together, turn right, anti-turn, and separate, together, separate, and now turn left, in turn, in the separation, come back into the corkscrew, and we'll repeat it from the top, and separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, together, separate, turn right, all the way around, come together, separate, together, separate, together, turn left, in turn. Now we're going to separate, together, turn right, anti-turn, separate, together, separate, and now turn left, anti-turn, come back to the front, and bring it together. Woo! And I'm doing it at the point where the transition happens from above to below the arm, if that makes sense. So 1 count. I think it's easier to initiate, but I think it's easier to initiate on the in-spin portion of the turn, but there's an in-spin portion of the turn both above the arm and the below the arm. So whichever one works for you. Like there's an anti-spin portion of the turn where you're pushing against the green. Do it on the half of the rotation where the poi is moving with the arm, if that makes sense. So like if my poi is coming this way, right? I'll just use one hand. Okay, if my poi is coming this way, right? If I move my arm out, the poi is going this way from this portion of the turn on, so that would be against the grain, whereas the poi is moving that way, which would go out on the back side of the turn, on the side closer to me. So I'm doing the movement on the part of the turn that is with the flow of the poi rather than trying to do some anti-spin or anti-turn weirdness, if that makes sense. To whatever you do with your right hand, make sure you do what would be the equivalent positioning. Okay, yeah, so this is also relevant. Just because you pick the point on one of the poi, like you can't do above the arm on both of them. One of them has to be above the arm and the other one has to be below the arm if you want to maintain your split time. Yes, I mean, of course, like that presupposes that you're just trying to stay in split time. This also, of course, can be done in, like, you could be doing together time ones, for example, which is a little harder because you do have to go against the grain with the together time one, and it's harder to maintain.